Stanford is a city with a strong and proud immigrant heritage. Generations of immigrants have made this city the culturally rich place it is today. We're also very aware of the dangerous journeys and painful separations that many people went through in order to get here. Beverly just shared with us her own story. People make the difficult decisions to emigrate to avoid violence, persecution, and a lack of opportunity, among other reasons. Many of the conditions they seek to escape are very much intertwined with the foreign policies, immigration policies, economic policies, and in some cases, direct actions taken by the US government in their countries of origin, particularly in the past several decades. Although Stanford's present generation of immigrants come from many places, a large number are from Central America, especially from Guatemala. John's book skillfully gives us the broad context of Central American migration, how and why it increases substantially in the past 10 years, the stories of individuals who came to the US, and the ways in which our government's failure to come to grips with the changing nature of immigration has had profound impacts on the immigrants themselves. I am so excited that John has agreed to share his insight with us today. Please join me in welcoming John Blitzer.
The keynote speaker is decided by height, so that's how I got here today. Two years ago, almost to the day, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security traveled to the offices of AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association in Washington. Waiting for him there, in a large conference room that was still somehow much smaller than this room, was a group of 40 immigrants' rights advocates from the most prominent organizations in the country. Everyone was in low spirits. There had been a possibility, remote but on the table, that Congress might attach a measure legalizing millions of undocumented immigrants to a must-pass budget bill. Shortly before this meeting, that bid failed. Meanwhile, for the second year in a row, the Biden administration was supposed to roll back a Trump-era policy that had suspended asylum at the southern border due to the pandemic. It was called Title 42. Each time, the policy was extended rather than wound down. Each time, there was a litany of technical reasons, operational concerns, political sensitivities, an uptick in arrivals at the border. Another year would pass before Title 42 was finally phased out. The feeling among the advocates was one of understandable exasperation. What was there to push for? How was it that, yet again, political inertia seemed to carry the day? The Secretary, meanwhile, had his own reasons for feeling beleaguered. The Biden administration had inherited a system that, on a good day, was badly broken, and which, in actuality, had been actively sabotaged by the previous administration. The world was convulsing in a moment of global mass migration, the likes of which were last seen around the Second World War. The domestic politics were bruising in the extreme. The right lambasted the government for opening the border, the left for closing it. So the Secretary, in this meeting, proposed a thought experiment. I say thought experiment, and I'm being charitable here. He asked a question that he felt he already knew the answer to. What did the advocates think, he asked, that the government should do if a migrant, with a lawyer, applied for asylum but eventually lost her case both before a judge and on appeal? Now, the idea here, what was sly and yes, definitely manipulative about it, was that in asking the question this way, he was controlling for all of the factors that made the system overwhelmingly unfair. The lack of lawyers, abbreviated hearings, years-long delays to reach judges, extended detention in the meantime. What he wanted, what the Secretary wanted, that is, was for the advocates in the room to concede that there were some people the government simply had to deport at some point. He asked the question and waited. No one spoke. None of the advocates budged. Now, this story has been told to me three ways. Each version, as it's been told to me, has a different moral. The first is from the government perspective, where the lesson is this: these advocates aren't willing to admit any of the harsh truths. If they can't concede that anyone should be deported, under any circumstance, how can they be clear-eyed about the realities of the system? That, to be clear, is the government perspective. The second version is from a contingent of advocates who are actually somewhat sympathetic to the government line, but also a bit skeptical of this exercise. Sure, they know the question was a setup, that it was rhetorical, and that the secretary was stacking the deck. But they would tell you, in hushed tones, away from the other advocates, or as we say in journalism, on deep background, that in the last several years, the conversation among many activists has begun to diverge rather too sharply from the policy stuff, from the nuts and bolts of government, from the balancing act of governing. So to this way of thinking, no one in attendance could answer the secretary's question because no one wanted to, even though they may have known better. That was the second version of the story as it was narrated to me. The third version was from advocates who were contemptuous of the question. The whole point, they tell you, was that the very things that the secretary was controlling for, that he was eliminating from the equation, are the whole game. It isn't guaranteed that an asylum seeker gets a lawyer. Many asylum seekers who have committed no crimes are detained for months on end while their cases inch through the backlogged system. When they do appear before a judge, the hearing is erratic. There aren't any consistent legal standards. Someone seeking asylum in Texas has much longer odds than another person seeking asylum in Illinois. Why does the secretary need to extract a categorical and theoretical answer from advocates whose mission is to correct the injustices of the system as it is? That's the third version of the anecdote, as I was told it. So by now, you can probably tell that I have my sympathies in these three different versions of the story, but that I do think that there is some small measure of truth in all three versions. Each interpretation, at the very least, brings something sharp and crucial into view. As a journalist, part of my mission is to try to enter the contradictory but interrelated, and I would say interdependent, worlds of people, to keep myself radically open to contrasting perspectives, to engage them, to subject them to scrutiny, to imagine myself in these different viewpoints, the better to ultimately analyze and critique them. When I first heard this account, however, it unmoored me in a particular way. It made me think almost immediately of someone I'd come to know well. Now, the context of the anecdote, as I've made clear, was Washington. All three of those versions were told to me by people squaring off there. In that setting, given those sensibilities, I could parse and disentangle the layers of nuance and tension. Whereas the person I knew, her name was Keldy Mabel Gonzalez Breve de Zuniga. Keldy was from La Ceiba, Honduras. She's a mother of four. She and I are roughly the same age. We met in the summer of 2018 in an ICE detention center in El Paso, Texas. 9 months earlier, she was arrested with her two young teenage sons in the desert of New Mexico. They were crossing the border, as so many people do, in the hopes that Border Patrol agents would apprehend them. These were not people trying to evade capture, quite the opposite. Keldy was traveling with a sheaf of documents, weathered documents, tattered documents in a backpack that detailed the horrors her family had endured back home. Between 2006 and 2012, 4 of her brothers had been murdered. When she testified against the men who assaulted and killed the last of her living siblings in 2012, the threats against her and her family began. They tried to escape to Mexico, but they were arrested, jailed, and deported. They moved. They went into hiding. They changed locations twice. Eventually, they came up with a plan. The family would split up. Her husband, Keldy's husband, left first. This was in 2016. He reached the U.S. and got a job building boat docks in East Texas. Their oldest son, Alex, who was 18 at the time, traveled with Keldy and his younger brothers to northern Mexico. But Alex decided to cross with an uncle who had acquired Mexican papers, which gave them a better shot at avoiding deportation to Honduras. that is, if they were caught. Keldy and the younger boys assumed that they had a better chance of clearing the U.S. border if they moved together as a family unit, a mother and 2 legal minors. So, in September 2017, 9 months before Keldy and I met, she and her boys came to the U.S. seeking asylum. What they hadn't known, because how could they, was that the Trump administration was secretly running a pilot program that was a precursor to the family separation policy that would get rolled out officially in the spring of 2018, the following year. Keldy was separated from her 2 boys. She was sent to the detention center in El Paso. Her boys were transferred to a different branch of the federal bureaucracy. Eventually, they were released to Keldy's sister, their aunt who lived in Philadelphia. Keldy remained in detention for more than a year. Because Keldy had been one of the first mothers to be separated by the Trump administration, she wasn't just a victim of the policy, but also a kind of singular witness to its accumulating horrors. At one point, she started to notice a pattern in the jail. More and more mothers were claiming that they'd been separated from their children. Keldy started to make a list on loose sheets of paper that she secretly shared with the women in her cell block. The list got passed around. It got populated with more and more names. This at a time when very few people on the outside, journalists included, legal advocates included, knew really nothing about what the government was actually doing. Eventually, Keldy mailed this list out to local lawyers and elected officials. I found out about people in detention from this list. And when I interviewed those people on the list, I ultimately found out about Keldy. The rough timeline of Keldy's story. A month after she was arrested, she had her first asylum screening, which is known as a credible fear interview. She passed it, meaning she could move on to the next stage of the asylum process, a hearing before a judge. It would be 7 months before that hearing took place. All the while, her family was scattered. Her sons were in Philadelphia. Her husband was in East Texas. Her mother was in Tapachula on the Guatemala-Mexico border with Keldy's daughter. Keldy was in a detention center in El Paso. After more than a half a year like this, in detention, she finally got to present her case, alone, without a lawyer, to a judge who rejected 90% of the asylum cases that he heard. The appeal was rejected. By the time a lawyer did get involved, it was too late. The decision was irreversible. A few months later, she was deported, and she started her trip again. This time, it was alone. She was trying to reach the U.S. border, but this time, she was too scared to try to cross it. Her whole family was on the other side of the border. She wanted to be as close to them as she could be. Here is someone, in short, who was given what counts as due process in U.S. immigration law. She had a credible fear screening, a hearing before a judge. There was a formal appeal. So I thought of Keldy when I first heard about the anecdote I opened with, because she was an example, in some ways, in the government view, of the sort of person whose plight we're all encouraged to grimly accept. And yet, you can't apply the Secretary of DHS's thought experiment to her circumstances, because if you did, you'd have to leave out some crucial things. Keldy did all of this, representing herself before a judge who rejected almost every case he heard from inside a detention center after having her children violently taken from her by the same government adjudicating her asylum claim. Say she hadn't been separated from her children. Say she'd appeared before a slightly more sympathetic judge. Say she had had a lawyer for at least part of the process. What would have happened then? As many of you know, asylum is predicated on a set of very particular criteria. By law, the U.S. must protect someone who's fleeing persecution based on their identity. The legal statute, though, defines identity in a very specific way. Was Keldy's case one of clear-cut persecution? For years, people fleeing street gangs in Central America struggled to prove that their persecution fit the criteria contemplated in the original statute. I'll tell you that one of the most revealing documents I've ever come across as a reporter was the transcript of Keldy's credible fear hearing. The asylum officer conducting the hearing did it remotely from Virginia. Keldy sat alone in a room with a phone at the El Paso jail. A translator in a different location, a third location, was patched in by phone. At multiple points, the asylum officer interrupts Keldy. She's furiously trying to recount the tangled plots of murder and flight and general upheaval. "You're not answering my questions," the officer says to her. Now, he was not badgering her. That much is actually clear from the transcript. He was trying to convert her hellish recent history into a tight narrative that was compatible with the strict, unyielding language of U.S. immigration law. At Keldy's trial before the judge months later, she was baffled by the judge's confusion. He didn't follow the arc of her story. The murderers who killed her brothers, he wanted to know. So these were different people? They weren't part of one specific criminal syndicate? Keldy left the hearing not quite understanding what the judge was failing to grasp about her life as she lived it. Immigration law and policy, to say nothing of politics, presuppose these clear, unbending lines that flatten circumstances, identity, and geography into discrete fact patterns. People's lives defy that neatness and that order. It's our job, and I use "our" here in a very inclusive sense, as advocates, as journalists, as public officials, as citizens of the world, to continue to assert the messy and inescapable realities of human life. These are precisely the complexities that fall out of the equation in pitched political moments and during so-called border crises. The policy questions are dense, to a certain degree insoluble. That makes the moral imperative that much clearer, to begin and end with people, to reckon with them, to get to know them, to live and engage with them firsthand. Addressing a crowd like this, true devotees to the cause who've turned out at 7 a.m. to hear me and others talk about it, I realize I'm preaching to the converted, and thank God for that. But I want to make the case for keeping human lives in a separate and higher register than the system they're forced to fight their way through. We are living in a moment when the burden has seemed to fall on the most vulnerable people to somehow answer for a system, our system, that is broken. It's the system they're forced to avail themselves of because no other system exists. The reality right now is really genuinely wrenching to try to make sense of. We're in an election year. Maybe you've heard, it's 2020. This is a period of sound bites, of sloganeering, of hyper-partisanship, opportunism, and frightening demagoguery. And through it all, large numbers of people are showing up at the border seeking protection and opportunity. Now, these numbers wax and wane, and this is a reality of the world that politics very rarely is willing or able to accept. But the fact remains, large numbers of people in this moment are arriving at the southern border in desperation, seeking to improve their lives. For the past decade, the predominant profile of those arriving at the border was that of asylum-seeking families and children from Central America. It overwhelmed the system in 2014 because the US government, for all of the money it poured into enforcement at the border, wasn't prepared for the arrival of people on this scale seeking protection. The administrative and structural challenges associated with this, from the government standpoint, had gone unaddressed for years. In 2019, then in 2021, 2 other US administrations were caught in crises caused by that ongoing story. You know, if you were following the news, you would understand these moments first as Obama's immigration crisis, his border crisis in 2014, or as Donald Trump's border crisis in 2019, or as Biden's border crisis in 2021. But these are all chapters of one ongoing story. Now, however, the population is even more global. There are Central Americans, to be sure, who are arriving at the southern border seeking asylum, but also Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, Haitians, people from all over Latin America and from all over the world, Africa, Asia. The majority of those who are showing up would not qualify for asylum. Not that they have a chance to meaningfully apply for it. The system at this point is so tangled and is so backlogged that it's not even functioning in the basic way in which it was supposed to. But again, to indulge a bit in the thought experiment of imagining what it would look like if people could meaningfully lodge their asylum claims, we have to reckon with the fact that under the circumstances, by the strict dictates of the asylum statute as it exists, a large majority of people showing up at the southern border right now would not qualify. That does not mean that their needs aren't urgent or grave. Some are fleeing the ravages of climate change. Some are fleeing crippling poverty, generalized violence, collapsing states. Again, the terms of the asylum statute weren't written with all of these situations in mind. In the same way that immigrants are forced through the immigration system and simultaneously are forced to answer for that system, the asylum system, in a way, has been overloaded with a burden it was never meant to sustain. The last time the legal immigration system was reformed was 1990. Think of all of the ways in which the world has changed since then. Because lawmakers haven't expanded legal avenues for people to come to the United States, to reunite with family, to work, to contribute, the pressure point has become the southern border. And so we find ourselves in a loop. Lawmakers in Washington say they can't undertake a more comprehensive immigration reform. They can't open legal pathways to people to come to the United States in a legal, orderly way because the situation at the border has to be tamed. And yet, the situation at the border is in a state of chaos, or has been in a state of chaos, precisely because lawmakers in Washington haven't widened the wider system, the larger system, to admit people to come legally. So the question now, as a journalist that I get most often, spending a lot of my time reporting on these issues, is whether asylum is dead, whether asylum can survive this moment, this political moment, this global moment. And there's really no question that all of the accumulated challenges have amounted to a serious issue. The system has been starved of resources for decades, it's fair to say. It's become a political lightning rod, which is the understatement of the century. The scale of need is really all but unprecedented. But it's also true that asylum has always been under threat. And this is something that I really stress to people. And again, I'm addressing a crowd. It's very satisfying and gratifying in some ways to address you guys, who I know are kind of read into a lot of these stories. But the kind of original DNA of the asylum system as we know it has built into it the sort of original sin of geopolitics and political bottom lines. And so in the 1980s, we could talk about the asylum system that in 1980 was first formalized in American law. But that happened at the same time that the US was prosecuting its Cold War agenda all over the world, but particularly in Latin America and most especially in Central America. And so what that meant was the US was supporting repressive military regimes that were persecuting large swaths of their populations in countries like El Salvador or Guatemala. And those people were uprooted. Hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted all through the 1980s. One of the most striking figures, because we try to attach numbers to make sense of this phenomenon. Obviously, many of you have lived this firsthand. But just to take one example, almost at random, the population of El Salvador in the 1980s, a quarter of that population relocated to the United States. A quarter. Think about the historical legacy of that. Think about what that does to the relationship in families between these countries. It means that it doesn't make sense to speak of the world in these very harsh, unyielding terms of the US and the wider region. It means, in fact, that there's a blurring of these worlds. But all through the 1980s, as you had at the time, and now it seems quaint to think of these as record numbers of asylum seekers given the volume and the kind of ways in which that has changed at the southern border, you had all of these people from Salvador, from Guatemala, seeking asylum at a time when the US government was granting asylum at a rate of roughly 20%. Those coming from El Salvador had their asylum claims rejected at a rate of 98%. Those coming from Guatemala had their asylum claims rejected at a rate of 99%. Now, the reason for this was because the State Department sat on top of the asylum process. And the US State Department had a vested interest in refusing to acknowledge that its allies in the region were committing brutal atrocities and were forcing people to flee for their lives. This is in the 1980s, in the earliest years after the creation of the asylum system. Prior to 1980, the asylum system and the refugee program, as we know it, did not exist formally. They were enshrined in the 1980 Refugee Act. So, you see from the earliest moments in this history, the promise and the principle of asylum already under assault and under threat. And I think, to the credit of everyone here, to my mind, one of the kind of key plot points in the 1980s, over and above the geopolitics, over and above US foreign policy, over and above the kind of contradictions of the American position on immigration, was that a community of advocates and activists were the people who were forcing the question nationwide. I'm referring to the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, a group of religious-based activists, people who didn't have expertise in immigration law, but people who were guided by a sense of conscience and a sense of common sense, and who recognized that then the Reagan administration wasn't making good on the principle of asylum. And so they took matters into their own hands in quite radical ways in retrospect, and helped cross people into the United States, Central Americans who were in need. And they all used to complain that in the press, the way they were described, because the kind of language of activism tends to be understood in terms of civil disobedience, was that these people were, sticking their necks out to break the law. But what they would all say is, no, we're not breaking the law. We're making good on the law. The government is ignoring the very law that it's been sworn to actually uphold. But this was all through the 1980s. Fast forward to 2014, I alluded to this moment before. That was the moment when, seemingly overnight, the Obama administration had to deal with the influx of tens of thousands of people seeking protection. Now, again, in political terms, that moment in 2014 was a shock. It was a surprise. No one had seen it coming. But of course, if you step back, and with the benefit of hindsight, of course, you see all of the historical antecedents. So the 1980s give rise to the 1990s. All through the 1990s, US deportation policy meant that large numbers of people who had been hardened on the streets of cities like Los Angeles got deported en masse back to Central America. This was a moment, actually much like the present moment, in which the domestic politics really drove immigration policy. The emphasis was on fighting crime, law and order, security. Immigration was understood very much in that context. Revealingly, there was also a Democrat in office. There was a lot of pressure. Take the year 1996, one of the most consequential years in recent memory, because of the passage of a draconian law that changed immigration enforcement as we know it. One of the things that it did was it allowed people who had been here legally, including people who had green cards, to be stripped of those green cards, to be stripped of their legal status retroactively if they had ever been convicted of a list of crimes that Congress expanded to include things like moral turpitude, drug possession. So you had massive numbers of people deported during those years. But one portion of that population were people who arrived in the inner cities of the United States and who found themselves very much in harm's way. Some of those people formed groups of their own, almost as a matter of self-defense. Those groups, over time, all through the late 1980s and early 90s, grew increasingly violent. Many of them were thrown into American jails, where that identity even hardened further. And eventually they were deported to Central America. So gangs, for instance, like MS-13, now a household name because a US president, for the first time in history, talked about it obsessively and incessantly. That gang started on the streets of Los Angeles in the 80s. And the reason it's associated with Central America is that it metastasized as a result of US deportation policy. And so in 2014, when people were showing up at the southern border, making their asylum claims, and encountering these difficulties in trying to reckon all of the messiness of the lives as they lived it with the very simple, stark lines of the statute, the asylum dictates, someone's being persecuted based on their identity. All of those very technical questions, a lot of people had trouble proving that the violence they were fleeing, because it wasn't a state actor that was perpetrating that violence, but rather a shadow state in the forms of these gangs, was forcing them to leave. This is a moment in 2014 that defined basically the future of asylum policy as we know it. It's what sort of set us in this loop. Nothing has happened between 2014 and now in any meaningful sense to equip the system to better deal with the realities that people are actually fleeing. So we can be both tormented and heartened, certainly in different proportions, by this history. Lessons have definitively not been learned. But some of the policy angles in all of this have become clearer. There are two I want to focus on. One, legal pathways, opening up avenues for people to come to the United States. This is the name of the game. unless there is some effort to make pathways to people available for coming to the United States in an orderly fashion, the southern border is always going to be the only way that people can enter the country. Now, we've seen glimmers of an understanding around this, but it's always circumscribed by politics and by the kind of exigencies of the moment. And so the Biden administration, for all of its mixed record, for instance, on immigration, I do have to say, had embarked on a creative thought experiment of trying to expand forms of parole to people from 4 countries in particular with very high rates of recent immigration: Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and basically give them a pathway to come to the United States, 30,000 a month, so that they wouldn't have to show up at the southern border and take their chances there. Within the first year of this very, very modest program undertaken by the Biden administration, the populations from these 4 countries showing up at the southern border dropped 90%. The point being, if people are given opportunities that they can avail themselves of to come here, they will take them. So that's one policy angle that I think kind of emerges from all of this, that enforcement alone, that tightening the border alone, is not in any meaningful sense a response to what's happening in the world. And the second point, which is a corollary, is that there has to be some way of moving this conversation away from the border. And I realize this is rich of me to say, having dedicated much of the speech to the border. It didn't occur to me when I was writing the speech. But, you know, the border bears the brunt of this entire conversation. You could be forgiven for thinking that anytime we talk about immigration, we're talking about the southern border. That's 2,000 miles of territory between the US and Mexico. As you all know so well, the immigration system is so much bigger than that. It consists of the legal immigration system. The problem is the attentiveness to that aspect of the system. Almost the entirety of the immigration system, as we know it, is all subsumed by politics and anxiety around the border. And it's understandable why that is, for political reasons, just for the fact of people in their desperation arriving there in large numbers. But I think if you talk to experts on this, increasingly what you hear, and this is one of the reasons why I say, despite the kind of grimness of the history, and despite ostensibly the fact that we've learned nothing through this history, I do feel at least slightly heartened and optimistic by the clarity of policy experts in parsing all of this, who say, look, if we want to make good on the principle of asylum, if we do want to meaningfully extend protection to people, one of the ways we have to begin to consider extending it to them is to think beyond the border, to think about protection in a much more holistic way. So maybe that means giving someone an avenue to begin their asylum claim elsewhere, en route to the United States, so that when they reach the United States, there is actually a process waiting for them that they can plug into. I want to return to Keldy. I don't want to leave you hanging on her fate or on her story. She, it turns out, was the first parent to be reunited with her family by the Biden administration. This was in May of 2021. The Secretary of DHS, the same one who I opened with, who asked that impossible hypothetical that I dinged him for, he was a big reason why this family reunion happened, it should be said. I was there when she reunited with her family. It was, as you can imagine, extraordinarily moving, immensely gratifying. I knew members of her family and had spent years, in fact, shuttling between them, which, by the way, is a luxury as a journalist that was not lost on me. That at a moment when Keldy could not travel beyond the US-Mexico border, when she was stuck in Juarez across the border from El Paso with her family in Philadelphia, I could make those trips, and I could take her children out to lunch and patch her in on WhatsApp. She had no ability to do that. So for me, it was extremely special to see them all together, and yet I have to say, I was very upset to see them all together by the fact of what they had gone through, the gratuitousness of the suffering. So I want to conclude in a way in which journalists necessarily conclude on these subjects. And this is one of the ways in which doing journalism on the subject does not map neatly onto speech making, because things just sort of peter out for me in the narration of the current situation. I want to say, and it's going to sound corny, but it is the honest truth, that I'm very moved by the work of building one community. And it gives me hope as a journalist and as someone who's steeped in this world, to see the level of commitment, the level of daily engagement, the fact that through all of the bureaucracy and through all of the politics, you all have been able to find meaningful answers and to continue the fight. So in conclusion, I end really genuinely by thanking you for inspiring me and others to continue to tell these stories. So thanks again.